Their architect, because we asked for a second interview influenced by you to talk to who was actually going to be working on the design. And when we did the second interview, they didn't bring that person along and they forgot our brief.
Oh,
So
wow.
that was sort of
Great big red flag.
a big red flag.
When he said, "Oh, remind me, are you one story or two?" I thought, it's a pretty basic thing to forget.
Yeah.
Well, Fiona and Ed, it is awesome to have you both here. I'm so looking forward to talking with you about your project and introducing you to the Undercover Architect community, because I know that you've got so much knowledge to share and your experience and all of the things in terms of making your project a reality. So thank you so much for being here. As we dive in, could I just get you first to perhaps introduce yourself and who your project is for? You know, who you're actually creating this home for would be really good to know.
Yes, so we're Fionna and Ed, and mainly for us, though we have had our 20-something youngest was living with us when we started and has just bounced back home now for a while. And we'd always planned to have room for our kids to do that. So that was an important part of the brief for us. And we're both in the semi-retired stage of life and didn't particularly want to downsize, but did want to age in place.
Yeah, that's a really interesting distinction, isn't it? That you want to make the home work for you long term in terms of you being able to be there as you change in physicality and all of those kinds of things, but also then accommodating that ability for kids to bounce backwards and forwards and knowing that you want to have some space. And I imagine too for guests to come and visit and, you know, people to come and stay.
We have a lot of family and friends who come and stay. And I guess the other thing is really looking into the future, if one of us was quite ill and we needed a carer that had to stay over or live in, or we needed two separate spaces because of illness. So it was designed with that sort of flexibility in mind.
Yeah, I love
it's been designed for the worst case, but it's really been designed to take advantage of the nice location as well.
Yes, so. Yes. And we both have sprawling hobbies, so...
And so can you tell me a bit about the size of the home in terms of just so people have an understanding of the rooms that you've got in it?
So it's essentially a 6-bedroom home because there are 2 studies, but
two offices, yes.
Two offices. It's about 293 square metres of living area plus the garage and then some external area. So all up, that's about 400 square metres under the roof space. It's built in 3 pods. I think the pod is the architectural term. Connected
Pavilions.
by pavilions, connected by 2 nice walkways, which provide good views to the large tree, which is a feature of the block, and to the gardens, which we hope will go in fairly soon.
Yes.
So, and
gorgeous.
It's an east-west block, so we get the great northerly sun and taking advantage of that.
That's fantastic. And you actually got advice to purchase the block, and then you joined Home Method about 8 months after you made a conditional offer, and it was 4 months after settlement. You'd started working with the architect at that point. Can you talk about the process of getting that help before you bought the block and making that decision, and then what made you decide that Home Method was going to be a helpful pathway for you?
So we were avid podcast listeners before we joined Home Method. And I also wanted to say we thought, what else could possibly be behind the paywall because you've been so generous? And I thought, but we have to join because you made such a contribution.
Oh, so that's kind of
and then we found there was lots behind the paywall. So that was good. So when we looked at the block, it had 2 regulated trees on it. One's the oak that we're keeping that takes up 30% of the block with its strip line. So 30% of a 1,200 metre block.
What an amazing tree.
It is. And the arborist, when he looked at it, thinks it might be the oldest oak in Canberra, or it's managed to mainline sewerage somewhere. It's just
had a steroid growth
and very healthy. So it's beautiful. And the other one was a cypress pine, something like that.
Bhutan cypress.
Bhutan cypress. And it was, so the oak's on the south of the block. Cypress was right in the middle. There was a very small house on the block that was filled with mold and asbestos, among other things. And the tree was right next to it. And so the block had sat there for a long time with nobody offering on it because they were intimidated by the trees. And that meant they were willing to listen to a conditional offer. And we sort of discussed that with the real estate agent. And we then they're a company called Space Lab, and they do a lot of town planning. And we paid them to help us put in a tree damaging application for the Bhutan pine. And I should say at this point, the block we purchased was formerly public housing. And so the chief ranger was arguing with the planning element of the same government. But we were initially unsuccessful, despite we had a fairly unhelpful advisor, the chief ranger, come out and say, oh, no, I think it's healthy enough. And she kept on lecturing us about we should have looked after the plumbing better on the house. And we kept on going, we don't own it.
Wow.
But we just stuck to our guns on we're not buying it unless this comes through. And when the turn down decision came through, there was a phone number and a signature block for someone in the chief ranger's office. And they were really helpful. And first they said, look, get some light modelling done. And we said to Space Lab, what were the light modelling costs? And it was something like $8,000. And we were saying, that doesn't feel like a reasonable thing to ask us to do. And everyone said, oh, don't worry about it. As soon as you put in a development application, they'll let you. And it's like, well, we don't want to, spend thousands on plans.
That's a big punt, isn't it?
And then I found out there was I said, does the chief ranger have a discretion in the legislation? And it turned out they did. So they very kindly let me write some dot points that basically said, look, you're going to let us later. We've got 30% canopy with it, which is what Canberra's trying to achieve without doing this. And so that eventually, there are about 10 dot points, and that eventually tilted the balance in our favour. But we couldn't have made that argument without getting the support from the town planners on sort of modelling the block and showing just how far the drip line was and all those sorts of things. So that was essentially what we did. And that really helped us because we just got that certainty about we would be able to build something reasonable. And we also, I don't think we started the tree preservation plan on the oak at that point. That was later.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. But it was, we sort of knew we'd have enough space once that pine was gone. So that was what we did.
Yeah.
And one of the builders we approached early also offered a block assessment service that said to us, buy something flat, let us check out the trees. And of course, we didn't take the tree advice.
What I love is the demonstration of your risk management alongside your tenacity and determination in that. So you weren't making, I think it can be really tricky to remember as you kind of set your heart on something and you keep following that path, that you always have an opportunity to get up to helicopter view and walk away, or be more objective about it, because you kind of have this sunk cost of both emotions and potentially financial costs in those incremental decisions moving you towards this outcome of trying to secure this block. But it's clear that you were able to still maintain some objectivity about it. I can imagine, though, for you to have pursued it at that level, you would have really wanted this block, but not been willing to sort of just then surrender to having to deal with difficult consequences of having to retain both trees. And so, yeah, it's a really great demonstration of holding those two things when it's such a personal endeavour, but you also need to make, I suppose, logical and sensible decisions because it's a big investment.
It was emotionally quite difficult, but I think we sort of traded off uncomfortable before the purchase for uncomfortable after the purchase.
Yeah, that's an awesome way of putting it, Fiona.
Yeah. But it was, we did sort of, have to really.
But the fact that a lot of people had looked at the block, including developers and builders, and nobody had said, yes, we'll take the risk, suggested to us that the risk was too great.
Yeah.
So we went conditional.
Yes. And the other thing was that an almost identical block next door, with the other half of the duplex that we demolished on it, sold for about 20% more, 25% more. So we could also say in our heads, well, we've spent a lot less than that on both the advice and all the implications that the tree management plan has in store for us.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was the other, I
Great
guess,
rationalization. Yeah.
rationalization we held
Yeah.
in our heads.
Yeah. No, I love it. Thank you for sharing that. It's really great
And
to
we
hear the
wouldn't have got
detail.
it. Like it's a quite tightly held area.
Yeah.
And we were just very lucky that we got it. So
Well, it doesn't sound like luck to me. It sounds like methodical, proactive kind of behavior. But it's it all paid off, which is really awesome.
yes,
So yeah.
yes.
And so that explains why you demolished the existing house and decided to build a new house, obviously being an older home, and possibly not having been very well cared for throughout its life, and that kind of stuff. It makes sense that that was sort of beyond redemption in terms of
Yes.
a workable building.
And if we look up when you look up the suburb, it says, because it was built in about the 1940s, and it says famous for its large blocks and poorly oriented houses, and it was, and no heritage listing rules, which across the road would have been, but
Wow, you really did your homework. That's fantastic. So now, can you think back to that time before you began the whole journey? Obviously, you've got that arduous kind of hoop jumping to actually secure the block. What were your thoughts of, what were your impressions of building? What were you nervous about? What were you concerned about? How did you kind of think about the whole thing about building a new home?
Well, we'd never done a home build. We'd done 3 renovations here, but our view of home building was that it was difficult and complex, and for a certain type of person that was prepared to be interested in that. So we weren't really interested in home building. We were trying to find a place to age in place, and we assumed there'd be a place we could find. And it turned out that everywhere we looked was suboptimal, and the idea of upgrading this place didn't quite work either. We've got a nice house. We could have put a lift in potentially, but we're still on the side of a hill, so we've still got issues here. And so we started thinking about building a place and came across a very nicely done place in Curtin by one of the local builders. And that encouraged us to think, yes, something nice can be done in a cost-effective manner if we can get the right block. Yeah, that's how we started.
That's where we started.
Didn't end up with either that builder or quite that budget, but
yeah. But you got to see it to believe it, hey?
That's right.
And so,
of course, at the time was that it was all the COVID issues or post-COVID issues of budget overruns and resource constraints and manpower constraints, which was another reason to think, well, do we really want to get into building? But fortunately, that hasn't been nearly as bad as we feared.
Oh, that's awesome to hear. So, and you obviously decided to work with an architect, and you'd been working with the architect for a little while when you jump into Home Method. Can you talk about, that process of choosing the architect and finding the right design professional to work with, and then, how all of that went in terms of working towards your design?
And oddly, while we hadn't joined Home Method, we had listened to the podcasts. So that made it really clear to us we needed an architect. Versus, say, a building designer, partly because the block's tricky. And we had an attempt at trying to find someone who might do the pack method. So we found our architect by interviewing builders.
Oh, wow. Yep.
So one was the company that we'd seen the very nice aging in place building had 2 architects and a building designer they worked with. So we interviewed one of them. Then my sister had 2 very nice renovations done by an upmarket builder, and he recommended Sonder, who we went with, which we'll get to. And then the third thing was, because we were checking out builders and architects, we went and visited lots of people who'd used one of the builders, and then we had turns out we had friends of Ed's who lived on the circuit we've built in, so they invited us around and they recommended their architects. So we ended up with 3 architects we were considering. And the one in the, and we interviewed them both twice. So Wendy and Claire at Sonder had just set up business, but they'd both been senior architects in bigger commercial outfits, and they were working on one big renovation with Picklemans. I'm only mentioning names of people we eventually chose. Then the one that worked with, I'll think how I'll refer to them, but the first building company we looked at.
You could call them the mid-range builder.
Yeah, the mid-range builder. That's a good.
They had been basically a generic builder and were looking to move up market.
And have in some cases.
Yes.
In fact, they've recently built a very nice, or not as nice as ours, we think, but spec home about 2 blocks away in the same suburb. But their architect, because we asked for a second interview influenced by you to talk to who was actually going to be working on the design. And when we did the second interview, they didn't bring that person along and they forgot our brief.
Oh,
so
wow.
that was sort of
great big red flag.
great big red flag.
When he said, "Oh, remind me, are you 1 story or 2?" We thought, it's a pretty basic thing to forget.
Yes.
The other thing may break in there is that builder and that architect had a model where they would basically do a conceptual design, and then you were expected to sign up with the builder, and then they would run the design process and own the design, and you were locked in.
So it was like a design construct, pseudo design construct model.
Yeah, it was a design construct. That I was trying to think of the term.
Yeah.
And we did say we went and met the owners of the company as opposed to the salesman, and we did say to them, "Are you willing to work with other architects?" So that didn't take them out of the game just yet as potentially our builder. And Wendy and Claire, and we ended up working with Wendy from Saunders, just really listened to what we had to say. So that was, and their quote was very detailed in terms of what they were going to do and for what price. And the third architect was a very prominent architect, and he was lovely, but he really wanted to go back to, we'd given him a brief and he really wanted to go back to revisit the brief and, draw circles of how we use the house and all sorts of things that you might do in usability, but we'd already done that. And he kind of wouldn't discuss price till we'd had multiple meetings. And we just thought, personality-wise, I felt I wouldn't get it'd drive me nuts because I wouldn't get closure quickly enough on things. So
we also had a look at houses that these people had designed.
Yes.
And we thought a couple of the houses that he'd designed didn't meet our idea of usability.
Yes. It's so, like people with adolescent kids who didn't have any bathroom doors, for example.
It sounds like you did really thorough research and thought about all the dimensions of how you were going to be kind of able to interact with them in terms of their ability to deliver a service, their capacity to provide you with the detailed information that you needed to have some level of comfort about it, and then also that personal kind of communication alignment as well. So
yes.
I love that you kind of, and that it sounds like you took your time. A lot of people can worry that that they need to make a decision quickly. They can feel like they're, it's not correct, but they feel like they're wasting the professionals' time, which, is a challenging but understandable kind of concern. But I love that you really did this very deliberately and thought about this being an important long-term relationship. So, and in terms of your design goals, you obviously had the aging in place that you've mentioned, sustainability, energy efficiency. How were you sort of working through those key goals and thinking about them as you started working through the design? I imagine that they were locked into your brief as really important criteria for you.
Yes, they were. I think, I'm just trying to think, because we started with Wendy had a go at a floor plan, and we then just started working through how we'd use each space. I think we've done a couple of renovations here and we've thought about it, and I guess both Ed and I in different fields have been design professionals, so we're just sort of used to working in that sort of collaborative way and considering usability and those sorts of things.
The other thing is that Wendy is very good at looking things up and learning, as indeed are the builders.
Yes.
So when Fiona said we want aging in place, Wendy was off to understand platinum level requirements in detail and work them into the design and things like that.
Yeah.
And likewise, things like the solar power issues and energy efficiency issues and so on. And it's been the same with the builders. They really enjoy going off and finding a course to figure out how best to build the roof, for instance. So they've been good at that. And in the case of Wendy and Claire, they were both senior designers from big companies, often doing commercial buildings. So they were finding their feet in doing domestic buildings and using this as a learning experience too. So.
And Wendy was doing her PhD, well, in parallel on social housing.
Wow.
But I think the other thing was both of us have been carers for elderly parents. So there were a number of things I just knew would work or wouldn't work based on that. So, for example, with it was one of our little debates, but with the bathrooms, every toilet has railings because I had the experience of my dad was in a retirement village and they hadn't installed railings. And there was this guy in Canberra that just specialises in fixing people's up railing. And when do you go, do you need them now? Because they look a bit institutional. And I kept on saying, we're going to figure out how we tack them around a corner so that we've got them now because I want the person who builds the bathroom to install them so we know where everything is. And for that, we used the commercial ambulance standard versus the accessibility standard, because that's, in my mind, actually better. So there was that kind of thing. There were things about Wendy designed a really nice solar-oriented design for us, but we both wanted our offices to. Our block has a set of gardens in the centre of the circuit, and so we both wanted our offices to look out over the gardens, which was west. So I remember that being a bit of a. She'd given me this nice northern-facing office, and it's like, no.
Are your offices near each other in the design, or are they at opposite ends of the home?
No,
they're just separated by the front door. So
yes,
quite close.
Quite close. Whereas at the moment, this is mine and Ed's is downstairs in theory.
Any flat surface.
And was the 3 pavilion design always kind of what fell out to work around the tree? How was that sort of the building form of that?
And that was in play from the first drawing, and our real struggle was getting the layout for the living. Well, there were two key tensions. One is we didn't want the guest room in our pavilion, so we wanted to have our bedroom with no guests there, which means we ended up with a bit of extra flex space in that pavilion in a slightly crowded front pavilion with the offices and the guest space. And the other thing was getting the living pavilion, because I don't like butler's pantries. So I wanted the sight lines to work in terms of how you walk in and what you can see as you walk into the living pavilion. So there was quite a bit of just toing and froing about how that could work given the restrictions of the tree. Wendy wanted the corridor to kind of align straight through the house, and I sort of wanted the kitchen area on one side of the corridor and the living areas on the other. And that ended up encroaching more under the tree than we might have been allowed to do. But we had a good team member, a consultancy called Goldleaf, who did the tree management plan. What he suggested is we just dug a trench where we wanted the kitchen to land and we could see no significant roots. So that let us have just that little bit more space on the south to make that work. But there were things like I measured the space that we know we need for Christmas lunch when we've got extras, so that I knew I could fit that extra table in, and we sort of played with different bits of furniture, those kind of things, and getting my office right was we sort of realised we could run a sort of slope right along the easement on one side that gave me enough room to have sort of the normal office and some creative space. And it actually gives the house a quite charming look, because whichever angle you look at the house, it looks quite different. So it sort of looks small from the frontage, and then as you walk around it, because it's it was called a design in the round, there's a German term for it, house, so you get all these lovely different angles as you walk around it, which is quite nice.
Which particularly excites the builder.
Yes.
He took me around saying, "Look, Ed, isn't this wonderful? Wendy's done such a good job on this view." Of course, Wendy, but yes, it does look nice in every
Yes.
angle, but different in every angle.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, so
And
it's a lot of working through how we'd use things, and we built in there's a lift for the stand mixer, all sorts of things to just help with.
what do you mean there's a lift for the
stand mixer? So there's a device that you can get where, you know how stand mixers are quite heavy?
Yes.
So it has its own little thing where it lifts up and goes to bench level.
That's
automatically.
fantastic. Yep.
Yeah.
And you said you don't like butler's pantries. Because that's obviously quite a contrary view given the way that a lot of people
It
do
is.
houses these days. So what was the decision around, what's your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are people end up having a kitchen that's an ornament and cooking in a cupboard. So I just think, so we do have, we've got kind of a preparing dinner station and a snacks and breakfast station at either end of the kitchen, so that there's ways that the kitchen can be used by multiple people pretty readily. And I have to say, our possibly our biggest extravagance in the house is we've got 2 zip taps. one at the breakfast end and one at the cooking end.
It's probably cheaper than an entire butler's pantry, though. Fiona.
How much? Yes.
Yes, that's right. I just think, and we've had lots of people advisors, but we've got our friends with a really really spectacular looking house and this enormous butler's pantry that's behind the other kitchen.
Yeah, it's been an interesting development over the last kind of decade or so, how much these have become prevalent in floor plans, not only in Australia, but in other parts of the world. So I love that you had clarity that it wasn't for you, and yet there was still a way for you to accommodate creating a kitchen that does do that job of multiple users at the same, in doing different jobs at different times of the day and at the same time. I also love hearing how much you've intentionally thought about the different ways that this house needs to operate in different seasons for different groups of people, thinking about not having the guests in near your bedroom, thinking about kitchen, the layout at Christmas time and how all of that works. So what really comes through is just how methodically and intentionally you've thought about this design in all of its permutations, so that you can get the house being flexible and adaptable for all of those different kind of life scenarios. So and also that decision, we are going to put the grab rails in now so that I know that they are installed properly. I'm not going to have to go hunting for them down the track in terms of where the noggings are. We know that all the walls structure is going to work. And then we'll just design the bathroom that it's not this glaringly obvious thing that when you walk in, it looks like a disabled, facility. So it doesn't look too utilitarian. It's still like a family bathroom. So yeah, for me, what's coming through clearly is you knew your own minds. Like you really knew it, and you found a designer who was able to kind of bring that, plus embrace this opportunity to learn. Were you nervous at all that they'd really had a lot of commercial experience and that your house might be sort of their first foray into residential as their own company?
Well, we said the bottom line was we probably chose the least experienced, most expensive of the designers. And we kind of had a moment after when we got the second floor plan, it wasn't as close to the first as the first was closer to our needs than the second. And we thought, and we actually got some advice from you. And one of the advantages of home method was we knew we could get that second opinion. But I think because we sort of had our second workshop after that, and there was just this sense they were really listening, and there were two things that really, I think, helped the whole relationship then. So instead of trying to, I think we were on holiday straight after the first one, and we were sort of exchanging emails, and we basically got out the floor plan and annotated it all instead of trying to do it in an exchange of text. And that being able to do that visually really helped all of us. And the other thing that I think Wendy might have even said when we signed the contract is she works on a 3-week turnaround. And so just knowing that was going to be the gap between our conversations. And the reasons for that is she's so incredibly thorough that, there's just so much detail coming through. So setting those two ways of working, I think, just helped us. And I think she really understood use of space and those sorts of things. And also her PhD work was on social housing in Vanuatu. So, in a very domestic setting. So, but it was just really, they listened, and that was, so we thought we'd be good. And in some ways the commercial experience was good because there were, things they knew about pragmatic materials and construction and all those sorts of things. So that experience was useful, I think.
Yeah, the key elements of the design were arguably tracing paper and cups of tea.
Yes.
We have 6-hour meetings.
We would have 6-hour meetings.
And there were a lot of cups of tea.
Yes.
So I guess, in a helicopter sense, we bought the block, and the block had an associated unimproved value. And so the first question was, is the block good value? And we didn't pay much more than the unimproved value, so that was a tick. And then a friend of ours who was very keen on home building said, you shouldn't spend less than the unimproved value on your build because otherwise you're wasting what's going on. So it sort of gave us a number. And so we put a reasonably tight number on the architect, and so she understood that money did matter. It wasn't a carte blanche at all. And that got her thinking in terms of how do I make something that's nice and interesting and architectural, but is not unnecessarily expensive.